A few years ago, there was a young middle school girl who had to endure what many middle school girls had to do. She had to get prepared for braces. And she had heard about the pain that was going to be there. She had heard about the discomfort that comes with that, and this whole list of things that she couldn't or really shouldn't eat during that process. And she was honestly at the point where she was ready to deal with all of that. She was okay and ready to deal with the inconveniences. She was ready to deal with the little bit of pain that she was going to have to go through, because they had been telling her the whole time that when this was over, she was going to have a beautiful smile and just be able to smile and light up a room with her smile. And so she was kind of actually looking forward to having these braces done and getting through this thing. But she was ready for all the physical aspect or the physical pain that was going to come with the braces. But what she wasn't ready for was the emotional toll that she was going to have to deal with when she got back to school. See, she got back to school, and she came to school, and she encountered some rather mean middle schoolers who were not kind to her at all. As some middle schoolers do, they made fun of her, they called her names, they came up with all kinds of terrible nicknames for her. And now some of you have been there, some of you kind of have been subject to this kind of taunting and bullying this young lady has been for. But unfortunately, this young lady, she didn't know how to deal with this emotional turmoil. She didn't know how to deal with this pain that she was feeling. It was just too much for her. So she started just trying to write things down, and she started to write a journal that she kept really hidden in her closet in her room. And she would write about how difficult her day was. She would write about the mean things that people said about her. She would even write down who said it. And this was the terrible nickname that they gave her today. And she wrote day after day after day about the pain that she was feeling and the difficulty that her life had now become. And one of the entries she wrote simply said this: "I can't do this anymore. This is too much for me to deal with. Life just isn't worth this pain." And that was the last entry she wrote in her journal before she took her life that night. One psychologist wrote that negative emotions like fear, sadness, pain, and anger are basic parts of life, and sometimes we struggle with how to deal with them efficiently. Far too often, people deal with these realities in harmful and sometimes very destructive ways. He goes on to say that people sometimes will withdraw from others. Others will turn their anger towards someone else and their pain towards somebody else by bullying someone else. He goes on to say that some people will turn this type of behavior into a high-risk behavior of drugs and alcohol to try to mask the pain that they're going through. And maybe some of you sitting here this morning or watching online, maybe you have been through a time or a season where you have encountered this kind of pain, a pain that is just really overwhelming. Or maybe some of you are sitting here right now and you're dealing with this right now, and you're kind of in this season or in the struggle in your life, and you just don't know what to do. You don't know how to deal with this situation, this pain, this injustice that you're feeling. And so this morning, I want to introduce you to a young lady that gives us a great example of how to deal with this situation, how to deal with bullying and how to deal with injustice. And her response to it is beautiful. She's going to pray through the whole thing. She's going to pray through the pain. The lady's name is Hannah, and her story is found in the first book of Samuel, the very first chapter of that book. And Hannah is a young lady, and she is dealing with tremendous amounts of not physical pain, but emotional pain. And she's been bullied for a long time. And I'm sure that some of you may understand a little bit of her story, but she gives us this beautiful example of how to deal with this situation, of how to pray through this pain. But instead of reading the whole chapter, I know I put the whole chapter on your on the bulletin this morning, and instead of dealing with the whole chapter, I'm going to shorten that up for a little bit, just for time's sake. So I want to kind of give you the background of the situation around Hannah's story, and then we'll actually start reading in verse 9, okay? So if you're flipping through your Bible, go ahead and look for verse 9. But Hannah was the wife of a man named Elkanah, but unfortunately, she wasn't his only wife. Elkanah has two wives. All right, he married Hannah first, and then he marries another lady, and he has these two wives. And I want to be clear that several times when you read through the Bible, there are several polygamous marriages that are presented in the Bible. But I want to be clear that at no point in the Bible does it ever says this is okay. At no point does it say this was God's plan or this was what God wanted, okay? In fact, if you'll read through those stories where a husband has more than one wife, you'll find that every single time that those things are presented to us, they're presented as fact because this was what was happening at the time. But two, every time they're presented, they're riddled with problems. Right? The biggest one is jealousy. There's usually jealousy between the two wives, and so that's what we have in this story. That the husband Elkanah loves one of the wives more than the other. He loves Hannah. He favors Hannah more than the other wife. But the other wife has a great advantage over Hannah. And while Hannah gets the love, the other wife has this advantage. She's able to have children, and Hannah, to this point, is not able to have children. And so the other wife uses this to her advantage, and she taunts Hannah, and she bullies Hannah, and she throws this in Hannah's face over and over and over again. Every single chance she gets. In essence, what she's telling Hannah is, listen, I'm better than you are. He may tell you he loves you, but look what I can do for him. I can do things for him that you can't do. That you are not blessed enough, that you're not righteous enough. And really, when it comes to, because you can't have kids, you're worthless. In fact, you're taking up resources that are valuable to this family. You're worthless to this family. You're worthless to your husband. I don't know why he keeps you around. And those aren't her exact words, but that's the kind of toxic atmosphere that Hannah is living in each and every day of her life. And she comes from this good Jewish family. And this good Jewish family is going to travel every year to the tabernacle. And at this time, it's in a place called Shiloh. And so her family is going to go as a whole family. Her husband, the other wife, and her kids are going to go to celebrate in this tabernacle. They're going to celebrate and they're going to worship. And they're going to have this feast there. And that's where we're going to pick up the story, okay? In 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse 9, you can read along with me. We'll start in verse 9. We'll read down through verse 18. But they're at this celebration. They have started the feast, and then all of a sudden, in verse 9, it says, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. And Eli the priest was sitting on a chair at the doorpost of the Lord's tabernacle. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of hosts, if you will take notice of your servant's afflictions, and remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her lips, and Hannah was praying silently, and though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and scolded her. How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine. No, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer, and I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depths of my anguish and resentment. Verse 17, Eli responded, Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the petition you requested from him. May your servant find favor with you, she replied. Then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for who you are. And God, I am so thankful for what you have challenged me through this text these past few days and this week. And God, I am so excited about the encouragement that I have found in and through this text. And God, I pray that that message is clear to everyone sitting here this morning and everyone that's watching us online, Father. God, there are people this morning gathered here, gathered in their rooms, in their living rooms, God, around the world, God, that need to hear this desperate message. God, I know there are people who are feeling pain and feeling struggles. God, they just don't know how to deal with them. God, there are some of us who have been praying things for a long time, and we're starting to grow weary of those things because we just don't understand why you haven't answered those prayers yet. And so, God, I pray this morning that you speak to us. God, wherever we are at and whatever struggles we find ourselves in, whether they're big or small, or God, whatever storms are coming our way, God, I pray that you speak to us through your text this morning so that we can do what Hannah does, God, that we will be ready to pray through this pain and be ready to receive what you have for us this morning, Father. And so, God, I pray with all my heart that you speak. God, I pray that we know that we have a place to come, to be in your presence, to hear your voice this morning, Father. God, I pray that you speak, and I pray that we are open to listen to you, Father, so that we leave here differently than when we came in, God. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. When I was in college, there was a situation that came up between a couple of the faculty and the administration of the school, and really it was kind of between two high-ranking administrators at the time, and one of them did something wrong. One of them went against school policy or the university's policies, and we won't go into all the details. And so he was a pretty high-ranking administrator, and then the other administrator was also a very high-ranking official and faculty member of the school. He was the whistleblower of the situation, that the situation had actually happened before. He just found out about it, tried to go through some different channels, couldn't get through what he needed to get through, and so he brought it to light. He was the whistleblower of the situation, that this thing was wrong, that it needed to be fixed, that something had, some injustice had happened, and this needed to be taken care of. And so there was this turmoil between not really those two administrators, because they didn't really have anything to do with each other, but it really caused a turmoil on campus. And most of the students and all the faculty, or pretty much the majority of the faculty, were on the side of the whistleblower. They understood, or we understood, that what had happened was not right, and there needed to be kind of restitution for it. There needed to be some justice to this situation. And so the board of directors, or the board of trustees, whatever they called them at the time, realized they had to deal with this situation, because there was a situation that was on campus and people were talking about it. It was in the newspaper. And so they had these emergency meetings of the board of trustees. And I remember being a student and just kind of waiting to hear what had happened in those closed door meetings that nobody was allowed to into. And after one of their first sets of meetings, it was announced that the guy who had actually broken student or university policy, that had went against the honor code of the school, he was actually kept in place. They actually voted to affirm him and keep him in his place with no restitution, no punishment whatsoever. And in the same meeting, they voted to take the whistleblower and demote him, and give him a demotion and put him out of the administrative part and back into a teaching role, because he brought this to light. And so this was a huge problem for a lot of us on campus. And I remember after hearing that decision, I had this sinking feeling of this injustice. This was just wrong. I mean, this shouldn't happen to a guy who was trying to do the right thing. This shouldn't happen to a guy who was actually right in the first place. You shouldn't punish somebody for exposing somebody else's wrongdoings. You should punish the one who did the wrongdoing in the first place. And I wasn't alone, but I remember feeling so mad and so frustrated that this injustice happened. And it just seemed so unfair to me. And I was so upset about it that this went on for weeks. And I remember this is one of those situations that it honestly ate me up inside. I remember going to class mad. I remember going to chapel mad. I remember I was just mad that this whole thing had turned out this way, because it just didn't seem fair. It didn't seem right to me. And so it started to eat me up, and I struggled with it so bad that I did something that I probably hadn't have done if I hadn't been in this situation. But I actually went to our campus minister, and he and I had a great relationship with each other. And I went to him and I said, listen, I know you probably can't talk about this because you're in the midst of all of this, but I'm struggling with this. This doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem fair to me. And I just really unloaded on him right there. And he had nothing to do with the situation. And then he was a great man, and he just very calming. And he looked at me, and he gave me this question that was one of those church questions that at the time I was like, that's not what I want to hear at all. And the question, he looked at me and he says, Michael, have you prayed about this situation at all? And at the time, that was not what I wanted to hear. And I looked at him and I was like, no, I haven't. If I'm going to be fully honest with you, no, I haven't prayed about this situation. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm too mad to pray about it. I'm too hurt to pray about it. There's just too much pain to pray about this situation right now. And so if you're asking me that question, the honest answer is no. And it took me until that moment to learn a lesson that Hannah is going to teach us very quickly in this passage. Because what he taught me in that moment is when he looked at me, and the words that came out of his mouth were this: what pains us the most should drive us to the deepest prayers. And he said, Michael, I've found out that when I want to pray the least is when I should be praying the most. And I know that may sound odd to some of you, but it took me until that moment to realize that it was okay to come to God in prayer. It was okay to not to come to God in prayer, but to bring pain and bring anger and to heartbreak to God. It was okay to pray about those things. And it was the first time I realized that it was okay to be fully honest with God about how I felt when I didn't think things were right. And this is the lesson that Hannah understood, and she makes it clear through the pain in her prayer. And I mentioned kind of her background story how she was the wife of a man who had two wives, and so she had this problem that she was childless. And so some of you know this pain firsthand. You've had experience with it, and you have wanted a child and can't have a child. And I have sat with couples that have been through this situation, and I can tell you that that's a painful, difficult situation, not just for the lady, but for the husband many times as well. And so some of you sitting here this morning or watching online, you can empathize with Hannah because you know that struggle. But you need to understand that as much as we can sit here and say that, yeah, I felt that struggle, hers is much deeper than what we have encountered. Because for us, sitting in America, our culture is very different than her sitting in the time in Jerusalem or the time in Israel. You see, even to this day, in parts of the world, there's a stigma put on folks who don't have children. That if you have children, you are blessed. God has given you those children. But if you don't have children, then you are cursed. And maybe God is punishing you for something that you did in the past. There's some reason that God has not blessed you with children. And so anytime somebody didn't have children, in those days, they would look to the couple and be like, well, one of them's got something wrong in their life because God's not blessing them with children. And then all of a sudden, you've got the husband who has children with somebody else, and bing, right away, you know, it's not him that's the problem, it's her. And so the stigma is not the couple anymore. The stigma is completely on her. There must be something in Hannah's life that God is punishing her for. There must be something in Hannah's life that God is not seeing. She's righteous enough. Maybe she's not responsible enough to have children. And so for some reason, God is punishing her. And so she feels kind of not only this personal desire that she's dealing with, but she also feels this stigma of this culture. And she knows what it's like to walk into a room and all of a sudden all the conversations stop. She also knows what it's like to walk into a room where it's quiet and then hear the whispers in the corner as people start whispering, you know, that's Hannah. She didn't have any kids. And all of a sudden, oh, we know what that means. She knows what it's like to walk into what we would consider the cafeteria, the well at those days, and everybody be talking and everybody being busy, and all of a sudden she walks up and she starts to try to have a conversation, and everybody just grabs their stuff and walks away. Because everybody doesn't want what happened to her to happen to them. They don't want the punishment that's on her to be inflicted on them, and so they're not going to have anything to do with her. She knows this feeling of loneliness. She knows what it's like to be the subject of every conversation and no conversation. She knows what it's like to walk down the streets and have people point at you and talk behind your back. And she knows what it feels like. What some of you have gone through, she knows the feeling. But for her, it doesn't stop. You see, it doesn't stop when she leaves the street. It doesn't stop when she leaves the well. It doesn't stop when she goes anywhere else, because when she goes home, it's there too. You see, she's the one who's childless, but her rival, as it talks about in verse 6, her rival doesn't know that pain, because her rival is the one who's bringing the pain to her. She can't just walk away from it. She is shunned by everybody, and yet the pain continues even when she's at home. In verse 6, we didn't read this verse earlier, but I want to read it to you now. In verse 6, it says her rival, Peniah, that's the other wife of her husband. Peniah, her rival, would taunt her severely just to provoke her, because the Lord kept Hannah from conceiving. And Hannah is being bullied even within her own home. And verse 7 repeats much of the same thing that verse 6 tells us, and is doing you to show this is how bad the bullying is. This is a continual thing, and it happens year after year, time after time. And Hannah feels worthless. And in their opinion, she is. She is less than a person, and since she can't give her husband a child, then she's useless as a wife, and really she's no good as a person. She is useless is the message that she's been told over and over and over again by somebody that she lives with. So finally Hannah reaches a point where she can't take it anymore, and the pain and the stress is just too much to handle. She is so distraught and upset that she breaks down in tears, and her family goes to this festival. It's supposed to be a celebration, and she can't even participate in the celebration. She can't even eat the festival meal, because the only thing she can do when this moment is deal with the pain that she's having to go through. And she does it the only way that she knows how. She's going to pray in this pain. She's going to pray through this pain. And you can hear it in her prayer. Even before her prayer, in verse 10, it says, deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears. And the writer of the verse, when he writes this in Hebrew, he uses the same word to start verse 10. He used the exact same word twice, back to back. And he does that to add emphasis for this word. And the word is sometimes translated, instead of great or deeply hurt, sometimes it's translated as greatly or great heaviness. And so we're talking about a heaviness that is so great, it's able to crush anything that's under it. A boulder or a rock, something that's so massive that if this was on you, you couldn't stand up but so long, and then your muscles and your bones are become literally crushed under the weight of this item. And so this is what Hannah is feeling. This is the weight she's feeling. She's going to be crushed by this pain, and this is simply too much for her to bear. This weight has been pressing down on her and pressing down on her for years at this point, and it's not getting up. It's not getting any better, and she's come to this breaking point. In fact, in verse 15, this is how she describes herself. She says, I am a woman with a broken heart. In verse 16, she says that she is praying from the depths of her anguish and her resentment. So understand that we have this lady that's in pain. Understand we have this lady that is brokenhearted, that she is crushed by the weight of this painful situation. And she even admits that she is resentful and angry about it. This is a situation that has a potential to drive her away from God. This is a situation that has the potential to drive a wedge between her and God. But Hannah does something all of us should pay attention to. When something hurts the most, when we feel like praying the least, what does she do? Instead of running away from God, she runs to God. She left the family behind. She left the mocking behind. And she goes to the tabernacle, to the place where she can encounter God. And so she learns and she shows us this great lesson that don't run away from God. Run towards Him. When you feel like praying the least, are the moments that we need to pray for the most. When you're hurt and you're being crushed by the pains of the world, run towards Him. When you're angry and you're resentful towards somebody else or a situation, run towards Him. When the world is against you and nothing seems right, nothing seems fair, go to Him. You see, I can promise you this. I don't know what your situation is or the pains you're dealing with, but it's never going to get easier the further you get away from God. It's only going to get harder the further you drive yourself away from God. And so the pains that you feel the most should be the ones that drive us to the deepest moments of prayer. And it's okay to bring your pain to God. It's okay to be brokenhearted before God. And it's okay to let Him know how you honestly feel about a situation. And I was in college before I learned that. And I want you to hear it this morning. It's okay if your heart is broken to cry out to God. It's okay when you honestly feel wronged by a situation. It's okay when you feel pain and anguish and you're resentful towards a situation or something seems unfair. It's okay to tell God that for two reasons. One, He already knows it anyway. And two, He's big enough to take it. In fact, that's the invitation. Bring it to me. Because it's too much for you to carry, but it's not too big for me. Hannah has come to the end of herself and the end of her strength and the end of her abilities. Her husband loves her and cares for her, but let's be honest, he can't do anything for her. He has tried, and there's nothing he can do to help the situation. And so Hannah turns to the only person that she can for help. And it's a very specific person that she addresses in her prayers. And so she gets up from the feast, and she goes to the tabernacle. And Eli, the priest, is sitting by the doorpost of the tabernacle, and he's sitting in this chair. But I want you to notice, she doesn't stop to talk to him. She doesn't even acknowledge that he's there. Because at this point, Eli is useless to her, just as useless as a husband, just as useless to everybody else. Eli is not this person of her prayer. He's not who she's going to. She's going specifically to God, and she has this very specific way to address God in verse 11. And so she goes to pray, bypassing every person, going to this one person in prayer. In verse 11, it says, making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of hosts. This is the person of her prayer. This is who she's pleading with, the Lord of hosts. Now, for some of you guys, you like to kind of know numbers. This is a common way to address God in the Old Testament. In fact, it's used 208 times throughout the Bible, but 2 of those are in the New Testament. 206 times in the Old Testament. It's the Lord of hosts. It's very common. It's another interesting thing about it, if you're one of these kind of trivia people, that the first time God is addressed as the Lord of hosts is in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Actually, in verse 3, it says that's where they're going to worship the God of hosts. And the second time is here in verse 11. So we don't have any reference to God as being the Lord of hosts before this, but at this point, from here out, it becomes a very popular way to address God. And it literally means Lord or commander of the mighty armies. Now, I want you to see the significance, because this is important for you to get this. Hannah is broken here. Hannah is feeling under attack here. She feels like that regardless of what she does and where she goes, the attack never ends. She's feeling like that the world is against her and that her rival is attacking her bullying her, and is relentless, and she's taunting her all the time. She feels attacked by her rival. She feels attacked by this cultural society that has this stigma over her that she can't control. And so she's crying out. Do you hear who she's crying out to? The Lord of hosts. She's crying out to the commander of the mighty armies. She's crying out for a defender. She's crying out for a protector at this moment. She's crying out that God, who commands not just armies, but the mighty armies, the armies of heaven, would come to her aid, to come and protect her from the attacks of enemies. She's crying out that somebody would come to her defense because she is defenseless. She has no strength left in herself, but she knows the one who does have strength. She has no way to defend herself or to protect herself from these constant attacks, but she knows the one who does. And so I don't want you to gloss over this, because I want you to be understanding that when you're praying through the pain, you can call on the defender. When you feel like you're under attack, either physically or mentally or spiritually, you can call on the mighty protector. That you can call not just on the armies, but you can call on the commander of the armies, the Lord of the mighty armies. I'm convinced that part of the reason we take prayer so lightly is because sometimes we forget who we're talking to. You see, we're not just talking to a friend. Sometimes we call him Daddy, and sometimes we call him Father, and sometimes we call him all these different names. But sometimes we forget who he really is. See, we're not just talking to a pastor or a priest. You're talking to the God of the universe. You're talking to the God who made everything and holds all things together. You're talking to the commander of the mighty armies. You're talking to the one who holds all power in his hands. You're talking to the one who gave you life and watches over every single aspect of it. And sometimes we need to be reminded, this is our great defender. This is who protects us. This is who we can call on in the moments of our greatest pain and our greatest struggle. This is who's ready to come to your aid. It's not your pastor, your priest, as much as we'd love to. It's not your best friend who's going to defend you and protect you. It's not even as much as you love your husband and your wife that's going to come to your greatest aid. Your greatest aid comes far beyond any of that. He is the Lord of hosts, the commander of the mighty armies, and He's coming ready to fight for you, coming ready to protect you in your deepest, darkest moments when everybody else can't do anything, when everybody turns their back on you. This is who you have to call on. And He's coming ready to wrap you in His arms. He's coming ready to shield you and protect you from any attack that you could ever even imagine. You see, but if we keep reading in verse 11, we've got to move past this person of her prayer and get to the priorities of her prayers. And then actually it circles back to the person of her prayers in an amazing way. And I'll be honest with you, as we start in verse 11, this is the part of the passage that has challenged me the most this week. And maybe for many of you it'll be the same. In verse 11, Hannah is praying. And she is pleading, Lord of hosts, if you will take notice of your servant's afflictions, remember and not forget me. And give your servant a son. Get this, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. The end of that verse about his hair never being cut is a reference to the Nazarene vow. It's found in Numbers chapter 6. In the Nazarene vow is simply this, that somebody, usually a man, would take a vow for a certain amount of time to be consecrated, to be set apart, to be separate. And it has nothing to do with the city of Nazareth, okay? So understand, it's not the Nazarite vow because they came from Nazareth. It's a Nazarite vow because Nazarite is the Hebrew word. It means that you were separated, okay? So for a time period, a person agrees to be separated for a dedication of God. And in this separation, they're going to commit to three things. They're not going to cut their hair, they're not going to drink any wine, and they're not going to touch a dead body or go near a dead body. Even if one of their relatives dies during this time, they're not going to go to the funeral. They're not going to go visit the graveside. They're not going to be around that. Okay? They're going to have nothing to do with death for this set period of time. And so different people took this vow for different lengths of time. Some of them took it for weeks. Some of them took it for months. Maybe a few took it for a year or a couple years. But Hannah is making this vow not for her, but for her son. She's making this vow that her son's hair will never be cut, which is putting him under this oath, not just for a short period of time. It's putting him under this oath, under this vow, for his entire life. That he's going to be committed and separated for God's work, not just for a little bit of time, but for his whole life. And so what she's saying is, God, if you give me a son, I'm going to give him back to you for all the days of his life. I'm going to give him back to you so that he can serve you with everything that he has. So that the reason she wants this son is interesting, because she wants the son so that she can give him back. I want you to think about that for a moment. Here's a lady who has been taunted, who has been ridiculed, who's been made fun of, who has endured all this pain because she can't have a child. And now she's asking for a child. But do you see the purpose in her asking for a child? This is the challenge for me. Because she doesn't ask for this child so that the taunting ends. She doesn't ask for this child so that the pain and the stigma that she's been going... She doesn't ask for this blessing because that's going to end. She doesn't ask for this child so that she can go rub it in Paniah's face and be like, ha, guess what? My husband loves me more than you, and I have a kid for him. That would be me, okay? Just to be honest with you, I don't know, if we're going to be honest, that would be me. Guess what? Let me rub this in your face. She doesn't ask for this child so that she gets to carry this child and she gets to feel like a mom. And she doesn't ask for this child so that she can walk through town carrying this beautiful little kid and all these people come up to her and squeeze the little cheeks and say, you got the most beautiful child ever. Because that's what we all say about kids, even if they're not pretty at the time, right? That's the most beautiful child I've ever seen. That's not why she's asking for this child. All the benefits that are going to come with this child, none of them are the reason that she's asking for it. This lady has been taunted and bullied over not having a child for years. And she says, God, if you'll give me this child, I'll give him back to you. And literally she does. If we read through the rest of the chapter, which we're not going to get through in this time, she literally at the age of 3, maybe even before his 3rd birthday, she literally gives him over and she walks away from him. She takes him to the temple, gives him to the priest of the temple because she says, this is the promise I made, and here he is. And she walks away from him. Now, she gets to see him. She gets visitation every year when she comes to this festival. But could you imagine wanting something so bad, that this is the subject of your ridicule and pain for all these years, and you ask for it just to give it back to God? It's a very different purpose than asking for it for herself. It's a very different reason to ask, because the benefits are not for her. She is literally saying, God, if you will give me this child, I'll turn him back over to you. If you will give me this child, then I will give him over to you because I want you to do something great with him. I want him to be a servant with you. And so I can tell you that this is like I said, this is the part of the text that has challenged me so much this past week. Because I'm going to be honest with you for a moment. One of the biggest prayers, probably most of us sitting in this room, most of us watching online, most of them around the world, probably the biggest prayer that we have prayed more than any other time in our life over the past weeks and months that we have prayed is simply, God, keep us safe and protect our family. I've said it numerous times. But now I'm questioning why I'm praying that prayer. Is it because I want those for me? Or because I want God to do something great with it? You see, we are able to pray and we ask for a lot of things and good things, but most of the things that we ask for are for our benefit instead of His. And so we've been asking God to keep us safe from this virus, and it's not a bad thing. Don't hear me say you shouldn't pray for that, but my question is, why am I praying that? Why are we as Christians praying, God, keep my family safe, keep me protected? And is it because I don't want that swab jabbed up my nose, I don't want to deal with that? Is it because I don't want to spend time in a hospital or be inconvenienced because I'm sick? Is it because out of fatherly concern for my kids, I don't want to watch them go through that? Those are not bad reasons to pray that prayer, but can I tell you, all of those are for my benefit. All of them. What if instead we started praying this, God, keep us safe and healthy so that you can do great things through us? What if we start praying, God, keep us safe and healthy so that you can use us to further your kingdom in ways that we can't imagine? God, keep us better and keep us safe and healthy so that we can be better servants for you. In a couple weeks, we're going to send kids back to school, and it's going to be crazy, and it's going to be different. And so many of us as parents and as leaders in churches and just in general, we're going to be praying for a good school year for our kids. But why? Is it because we want it to be easy for them? Is it because we want a good school year so that we don't have to hear the cries of, I don't understand this homework? Is it because we want life to be easy for them? Or are we simply going to pray, God, make this a great school year for my kids so that he can be or she can be a better servant for you so that they have a great opportunity to be used by you? Maybe instead of praying for patience for our teachers, we should be praying that God uses their patience to demonstrate the love of Christ to kids. Maybe instead of praying for your job tomorrow that it's quiet and it's calm and everything works out, maybe you should be praying for your mission field that God is sending you to tomorrow. It's a very different reason to pray. Part of the reason that our prayers may not be getting answered is because we want it for ourselves and not for Him, because we're praying not for something that's wrong, but maybe for the wrong purpose. You see, it's not in the text, but I can almost guarantee you that Hannah has prayed for a child over and over and over again. And like I said, that's not from the text. I'm just inferring that into the text because she's going to God with this. She's been to the tabernacle every single year. She knows that God can do this for her, and yet time after time after time again, she doesn't have a child. And it's not until the moment when her desire for a child, when her purpose for this child aligns with God's plan and purpose for this child, when her will for a child aligns with God's will for this child, there's a timing issue that's got to be worked out on God's behalf here. But we don't see her prayer being fulfilled until the fact that she doesn't want a child for herself. She wants it for the furtherment of God's kingdom, that she wants it because it's going to benefit God, because she wants God to do something great. And that's when she gets the answer that she's hoping for. It's only when she prays with the purpose that God is going to be able to use what He gives her. And even though this answer doesn't come right away, there's this sense of peace that she receives after she prays. And Eli is the priest. He's watching Hannah pray, and it's this kind of this odd situation. I want you to imagine you walk into a church, the pastor is sitting by the back door, and he's just hanging out there, sitting in a chair, not doing anything at the moment, because pastors, we only work for like an hour and a half, one day a week. So if you come by any other time, I'm probably just sitting by the front door waiting, doing nothing, twiddling my thumbs. That's what Eli's doing here. This is festival, this celebration's going on, and Eli's doing nothing except sitting by a chair. And this lady walks in, and she doesn't address him, she doesn't deal with anything, and that's no problem. She walks in and she goes, I imagine, to her knees and to her face, and she's desperately crying out to God. And Eli just sits there and watches. And he watches her pray. And he watches her pray, and he doesn't know that she's praying. He thinks that she's drunk because he sees her mouth moving but no words coming out. It tells you a little bit about the culture and the society that's going on at that time. If somebody walks into church and I see them come down to this altar, I see them take one of those seats, and I see their lips moving but no words coming out, and the first instinct I have is, no, they must be drunk. It tells you a little bit, we may have a societal problem if that's the first instinct of the priest. Instead of, hey, this person is desperate. This person's crying out in anguish. This person is dealing with something I don't know about, and I need to go figure this out, and I need to work with them through this. If my first instinct is they're here because they're drunk, maybe that's a problem. And maybe Eli is just so bad of a judge of character that this is what he deals with. But he thinks she's drunk, and this is the behavior. And so he goes and he tells her, he gets onto her for drinking, and he's like, stop, you just need to stop drinking. In verse 15 and verse 16, she explains to him what's going on. She says, listen, no, I'm brokenhearted. I'm pouring my heart out before God. I'm praying to Him from the depths of my anguish and my resentment. We've talked about those verses already. And she's like, listen, I'm not drunk. I'm just praying. And she's pouring out her soul to God. And she is so full of anguish and so full of resentment, but she's not full of wine or drinking at the moment. And I'm almost challenged by that right there, to be honest with you. When was the last time you were so in depth in prayer that somebody looked at you and like, I don't know what's going on over there, but it's different? When was the last time you poured out your heart so uncontrollably before God that somebody was like, oh, I don't even know what that looks like? And yet they saw you and didn't understand it. So then in verse 17, after she tells him, no, listen, I'm not drunk, I'm just mad, and I'm angry, and I'm frustrated, and I'm hurt, and I'm praying through all of this. In verse 17, Eli gives her this response. And he says to her, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the petitions you've requested from Him. Basically, I hope God gives you what you want. I want to be clear that at this moment, she doesn't become pregnant. Like, there's not this magical event, there's not this miracle that happens that she's on her knees, she's praying for God. Eli comes and says, hey, quit drinking. And she gets up and she's like, no, I'm just heartbroken. I'm mad about this. And Eli's like, all right, good. I hope you get what you want. Boom. She shows up and she's got this belly sticking out. That's not what we read in the text. Okay? And from this moment, at this moment, there is no physical difference for her whatsoever. There is no evidence that she's going to have a child whatsoever at this moment. She doesn't become pregnant at that moment. She doesn't become pregnant and going to have a child at that moment. In fact, we find out in verse 20 that it takes some time. It says, after some time, Hannah conceived and gave birth. So it doesn't happen right away. She doesn't get what she wanted at that moment. In fact, she doesn't even get it the next day. After some time. We don't know what some time is, but we know it didn't happen then. But what she does walk away from that moment is, she walks away with this peace that she didn't have before. We see it in verse 18, the last verse that we read together. It says, then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. If we remember reading back in the text, she went to the festival and she couldn't even eat. She was so upset in this celebration. She was so heartbroken she couldn't even eat. And now she goes on her way. She eats and she no longer looks despondent or sad. And one commentator writes that the mere expectation of a child was enough to fill her with hope and joy. You see, Hannah leaves the tabernacle very different than she walks in. When she walks into the tabernacle, she is weeping, she is brokenhearted, she's in anguish, and she's full of resentment towards this whole unfair situation. She's mad that she's being punished and the one who should be punished is not. She's angry probably at Peninnah. She may be angry at her husband. She may be angry at society. She may even be mad at God. That's how she walks into the tabernacle. And when she walks out, there's hope, there's joy, and there's a peace. A peace that she couldn't find anywhere else except being in the presence of God. You see, you understand that for them the tabernacle is not just a building. For them the tabernacle is not just a place you go to have service. It's not just a place to go worship. It was the place that represented the presence of God. And so she finds in the midst of the presence of God, this is the only place that she can have peace. The only place where there is comfort from her pain. The only place that she can feel any relief from this pain she's dealing with. Joseph Scraven is now a classic hymn writer. He died in the 1800s. But he wrote this very famous hymn that many of you may know. It's simply entitled, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And you need to know a little bit about his life. He was engaged to get married once. The first time he was engaged to get married, his wife drowned the night before their wedding. He went through a time of depression and a time of dealing with that grief, as most of us would. And finally, he switched things around. He moved to a different area. He fell in love with another young lady and proposed to her. And they were set to get married. And a week before before they were getting married, she got deathly ill. And she died days before her wedding. That's two. So distraught and not able to find any comfort with anything, he said, I'm going to give up. And I'm going to just live my life in destitute. And I'm going to give everything I've got to the handicapped and to those who can't afford things for themselves. And so he lived his life in such a way that he had nothing to his name, that he had no financial situation, he had no portfolio. He may have had a house to live in, I don't know. But he lived in destitute. His mother was in England and she got deathly ill. And so they sent a letter to him saying, you need to come home right away because this is going to be the end for his mom. You know, he didn't even have enough money to go home and see his mom before she died. So you know what he did? He wrote her a letter, a poem, that actually became the lyrics to this song of What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And there are these famous lines that are so true. And it simply says this. In the midst of all this turmoil and chaos that he had been living through, he writes this, Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know the level or the source of your pain this morning. I don't know if you've been bullied in your life and taunted by things that are beyond your control. I don't know if you're facing some kind of physical situation that you have no control over. I don't know if it's a situation that everybody else has told you is hopeless. I don't know if you're facing some kind of unmet expectation or a situation that is honestly just unjust and unfair to you. It could be a million other things. I don't know. But I know this. You're going to continue to forfeit the peace. And you're going to continue to bear the pain until you carry it to God in prayer. Unless you're willing to carry everything to God in prayer.